Vellum scrolls stacked up in the Parliamentary Archive. These have made it into law, but a good few more are going to have to join them on the shelves if we're to be ready to leave the EU on the 29th of March.
The primary legislation, the bills and the acts, are about bringing back powers from Brussels, so things that Brussels used to do for us. This gives ministers in the UK the powers to do things. So, for example, the trade bill. Previously, all of our trade agreements have been struck in Brussels by the EU on behalf of us. The trade bill gives ministers here in Westminster powers to roll over some of those trade agreements and renegotiate them.
As well as the trade bill, there's also an immigration bill to get through, a financial services bill, an agriculture bill, a fisheries bill, and an international healthcare arrangements bill. And then, on top of that, there's a whole ton of secondary legislation, so-called statutory instruments.
The secondary legislation is about updating the UK statute book to get rid of erroneous references to EU law, EU agencies, the EU itself, and making sure that our statute book reflects the fact that we are no longer an EU member.
Will the Leader of the House please give us the forthcoming business?
So today there was little surprise when the Leader of the House, in charge of getting all this legislation through the Commons, announced that she was cancelling MP's February break.
I realise that this is short notice for colleagues and House staff, but I do think our constituents will expect that the House is able to continue to make progress at this important time.
But is the cancellation of the break just a bit of PR? Because when the government listed the Commons business for next week, there was not a single piece of Brexit legislation amongst it. Because the government has so little control of the Commons, many think that ministers are too afraid to bring in any of that legislation for fear of what MPs will do to it. And it's not just the Commons that's causing a headache. One of the problems is there's a bit of a logjam in the House of Lords. The government tries to get these statutory instruments through in bundles to save time, but there are a few Labour peers who insist on unbundling them, talking about them one by one. One government insider described it to me as rather like someone who insists on paying their parking fine with a bucket of pennies. It's irritating, it's time-wasting, but it's ultimately pointless. The fine gets paid, the legislation goes through.
636 pages, 2.54 kilos, 11 disparate subjects addressed to this House as one statutory instrument.
The peers involved, though, insist they're not trying to sabotage Brexit.
No, I mean, we are here to do a job. Parliament, in a parliamentary democracy, has to scrutinise things. Otherwise, we'll end up with unintended consequences, with bad legislation. But even rushing things through, even doing things very quickly, it's impossible to get 6 bills through, 600 statutory instruments, scores of treaties that need to be ratified. All of these will take time.
Indeed, the Foreign Secretary today was the first minister to concede that the government may need to delay the March the 29th Brexit date in order to get all the necessary legislation through.
I think it is true that if we ended up approving a deal in the days before the 29th of March, then we might need some extra time to pass critical legislation.
In fact, experts agree that a deal scenario could be more problematic for the government from a legislative point of view than a no-deal scenario. After all, with no deal, ministers could always rely on emergency powers.
So are the Lords performing their constitutional role or on a mission to impede Brexit? 2 members of the House are with us now, Andrew Adonis, an ardent Remainer and former Labour minister, and Peter Lilley, Conservative and equally ardent in his support for Brexit. Lord Adonis, let's start with you. I've heard it said in Whitehall that there is filibustering going on and you are one of the people doing it. Is that fair?
Well, the big logjam at the moment is in the government itself. There are 600 statutory instruments, these are the regulations, which are required if there's going to be a Brexit at the end of March. The government's had 7 months to lay them. It's only been able to lay half so far, and of those just over 300 that it's tabled, only 106 have gone through. Now, all of these problems have been caused by the government. They simply haven't been able to prepare and lay these very complicated instruments. Some of them run to hundreds of pages.
Okay, so
we've been passing them remarkably quickly. I mean, we have been debating them, but that's our job. Our job isn't to be a rubber stamp and simply to allow the government to rule by decree.
But we haven't been holding them back. You're not making interventions for the sake of it. You're not trying to use this as a particular way of slowing down and frustrating Brexit.
Every regulation that the government has tabled, the House of Lords has passed in a timely fashion. The big logjam is in the government itself, where nearly half of these regulations still haven't been laid. There are only now 33 parliamentary days until Brexit. No one in Whitehall thinks it's going to be possible to make all the changes to the statute book that are needed for Brexit, and including the Foreign Secretary, who said this morning on the BBC that we would probably need some extension if we have a no-deal situation at the end of March.
Do you accept that? Or do you think they are filibustering? Do you accept that this has been brought on far too late for such a complex legislative...
Let us be absolutely clear. All these pieces of legislation passed through Parliament under the European Communities Act, which meant they got no scrutiny at all because Parliament could not reject them. So now we have the hypocrisy when we actually change them into British law, under which they will be capable of being rejected or altered or amended, we're suddenly told, oh, it's frightfully important. We spend hours and hours looking at these things which we've never looked at before for 45 years. What hypocrisy.
Well, there's no hypocrisy at all. The government said to Parliament, this is supposed to be taking back control. The government said to Parliament that we would debate them. And it's not just that these things are being transposed. Regulation by regulation, big changes are being made. Can I give you an example? Credit card fees. The regulations in respect to credit card fees, which at the moment cap fees across the EU, the regulations we've been given will only in future cap them within the UK because we're withdrawing from the EU. But there are a lot of policy options as to whether we could continue to apply caps. These are things which Parliament should debate because they affect every individual up and down the country.
You regard this as cynical, but what are they supposed to do? Just rubber stamp everything that the government puts in front of them?
The process, the government has set, or Parliament has set up a committee on which I sit called the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee. We go through all these pieces of legislation to see that the government isn't cheating, that all it's doing is replacing references to a European institution by ones to a UK institution. But we also say, oh, if the consequence of this is a change of the sort that Andrew suggests, then it should go to the full House and they should have a chance to look at it. I'm very happy to do it. I rejoice in the fact that we can. And I want us to be in a position in future to alter these. Andrew, however, wants to revert to the previous situation where no scrutiny would be necessary or possible because we'd never be able to reject them. You do, Andrew, don't you? You want us to go back into Europe where these laws would never be capable of amendment by our Parliament.
Hold on, Peter's confusing two different things.
Yeah, let's not reopen.
Of course, I'd rather we stayed in the EU, but that's not the point. The point is here.
But if we did, you would not be able to do what you're doing.
It might be the point if you were using this as a field to struggle for that aim, to keep us in the EU by running out the clock on legislation.
Let's be clear, Peter and I are in fact agreeing. He is saying that Parliament should play its proper role in scrutinising these regulations. That is what we are doing. The big blockage is not in the House of Lords. The big blockage is in Whitehall, which is just proving incapable because of the volume in preparing all the regulations which we have to enact by the end of March.
Do you agree with what the Foreign Secretary said today, that it is looking pretty unlikely that this can be done? A few hundred statutory instruments.
If we got a deal, we might need to push on. I didn't quite understand that. But so if we got a deal, surely the deal would automatically give us some interim period. I didn't understand what he said.
Transition period,
and I think he's altered that. But let's be quite clear. We should, of course, look at these things in detail. That we are. That's fine. If, however, a party, I don't think Andrew could do it on his own, but if the Labour Party were to behave irresponsibly, which I don't think it will, and try and slow down this, then any of these measures which weren't properly considered would automatically become law if they're negative instruments. So that's no problem as far as that's concerned. It's bad
by default
procedure. Yeah, they become. If they're affirmative instruments, which is the more serious kind, then the government can make them, which means that they become law and will continue as law if both houses approve them within 28 days. So we can get over that interim period as far as all these 600 instruments are concerned, and incidentally more than 60% of them have been laid rather than less than half.
Hold on, can I just make it clear, though? That has happened in the course of 7 months. 350 of 600 have been tabled in 7 months. We have 2 months to go. 33 parliamentary days. It is simply not possible to do all this in time.
Is it actually possible by March 29th, in your view?
The committee asked all the departments for a schedule of when they were coming through, and they're coming through roughly according to schedule, and we think we'll have them all done.
But they've been crunching together an awful lot of statutory, bundling them.
We knew there would be a lot, and there's going to be a lot of work. I don't mind that work. I'm prepared to work night and day. I don't mind losing this half term, my wife may, but so of course we've got work to do, and we ought to do it, but we should do it in a constructive fashion, looking very closely at the legislation, but making sure we get it passed, but knowing that if we don't, it's not going to prevent Brexit.
That schedule does not show that we can complete this by the end of March. Let's be clear. Next week, to take an example, we have 19 of these statutory instruments coming before the House of Lords. That's 19 of the remaining 350. That's 1 of the 8 weeks before we leave the EU. I'm afraid we're in fantasy land at the moment, and it's very notable that the Prime Minister, when she's been asked 7 times now whether we're definitely leaving the European Union on the 29th of March in the last fortnight, she hasn't answered. The general view in Whitehall is that it is simply not going to be possible for us now to leave at the end of March. The question is how long a period of extension we ask for.
It's a hypothetical question in a way, because the legal default is the 29th of March. If that wasn't there, how long would you say you needed to get... Would it be July? Would it be August? I mean, when would you actually...
It's the job of the government to tell us how long they're going to need. They won't tell us at the moment. All we've heard from the Foreign Secretary this morning is they're going to need longer. A responsible government would be telling us. Now, I've been in politics seriously for 20 years. I have never seen such chaos in Whitehall and in Parliament as we're witnessing at the moment, when we're approaching a cliff edge, which could have really serious consequences for people and businesses up and down the country.
I think we'll manage the programme in the government's business OK, but if anyone wants to try and create problems, they might be able to create some minor problems for people. In the grand scope of things, they'll be quite minor, but for individuals, they might be quite major, and I just think it would be irresponsible for the opposition deliberately to filibuster. I don't think the Labour Party will, but Andrew seems to want to see that happen, and there isn't chaos. No. There's a legitimate criticism of the government that they haven't been frank about what they're doing, because they've been trying to frighten MPs to agree to their wretched deal.
OK, well, on that one point of consensus, there we wrap it up. Thank you both, Andrew Adonis and Peter Lilley, for your thoughts on that.